could Cincinnati's poverty problem be worse than we realize? The latest numbers suggest roughly 30% of people living in Cincinnati are living in poverty.
But some community leaders say the measuring stick for determining who's living in poverty is way off. Kyle Inskeep reports for our ongoing investigation into childhood poverty in Cincinnati.
For me, with a family of 5, I still feel like I'm at poverty or below poverty.
But according to federal poverty guidelines, this Cincinnati single mother who works full-time makes just barely too much to qualify for any government assistance.
Because at some point it just feels like giving up and just accepting the benefit is the best thing, but then you're stuck in that cycle. And I just wanted more for my kids at this point, so we just struggle together.
Ross Meyer is the interim CEO at the United Way of Greater Cincinnati. He would classify Andrea as a member of what he calls the working poor.
The challenge is that for especially folks, the working poor, who are working but might not qualify for those benefits, they're really struggling.
Federal poverty guidelines determine who does and does not qualify for government assistance. The Center for American Progress, a left-leaning Washington, D.C. think tank, authored a report outlining why it believes the current poverty guidelines may not be a fair barometer. One of the main points: the rules make no adjustments for geographical variation, despite large variations in cost across areas and regions of the country.
It was an antiquated measure that was developed in the 60s. Many folks will tell you that roughly double that is a more accurate number for what families really need to meet the basics.
For a family of 5 like Andrea's to qualify for federal assistance, the household income would have to be less than $30,000 annually. Now, that would be the same if Andrea lived in a more rural area like Pendleton County, Kentucky, or one of the most expensive places in the world, New York City.
We know that the official poverty measure, which by itself is way too high for our community, really doesn't capture what it takes for families to make ends meet.
Political analyst Scott Rasmussen says because federal poverty guidelines don't factor the cost of living in different regions, they may not actually be a good indicator of the number of Americans struggling to make ends meet.
But I do know that generally speaking, the official government figures overstate poverty in rural areas and understate it in urban areas.
Rasmussen's recent research on poverty here in the U.S. also led him to this finding.
Only 19% of Americans believe that people who are living in chronic poverty are there because they're simply lazy. Most Americans recognize there are larger issues at play.
Eventually my hard work is going to pay off, and if it's for nothing but for them to watch and to learn something from it, we'll be okay.
Organizations like the United Way of Greater Cincinnati want to help local families make their way out of poverty and at the same time push for changes to how federal poverty thresholds are actually determined.
There's policy that needs to change. That's why United Way advocates for changes to federal and state policy to really provide not only a strong safety net, but really to help people get ahead.
I honestly just feel like if what their guidelines are just reviewed, taking into consideration what typical rent is or what typical Duke bills are, the necessities. My cell phone, I don't care about that, or, it's the necessities that I feel like should be taken into consideration.
In Cincinnati, Kyle Inskeep, Local 12 News.